HOA set fire to my grandpa's WW2 Jeep, but they didn't know about its historical status. Before we start the story, please comment from which country you are watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become our member for more HOA revenge stories just like this one. I never thought I'd see my grandfather's prized WW2 Willys Jeep go up in flames, but that's exactly what happened when our power-hungry HOA president decided it was an eyesore that violated community standards. What she didn't know was that this wasn't just any old vehicle. It was a registered historical artifact with federal protections that would bring her entire HOA empire crashing down around her. Sometimes revenge doesn't need planning, it just needs the right paperwork. My name's Michael, and last year I inherited my grandfather's house in Oak Ridge Estates after he passed away at 94. Grandpa Frank had been a WW2 veteran, serving in the European theater where he'd driven one of the thousands of Willys Jeeps that helped win the war. After returning home, he managed to get his hands on one of those Jeeps and kept it in perfect working condition for over 70 years. "This Jeep saved my life more times than I can count," he'd tell me when I was growing up. "Got me out of artillery fire in France and carried wounded men to safety outside of Berlin." The Jeep was more than just a vehicle to him, it was a connection to his past and the friends he'd lost. He'd registered it as a historical vehicle with the State Historical Preservation Office and even received recognition from a military museum that documented its service history. When I moved into his modest ranch-style home at the edge of Oak Ridge Estates, I knew the HOA might be a challenge. Grandpa had mentioned running into problems with them over the years, but he'd always managed to work things out. What I didn't realize was that a new HOA president, Diane Winters, had taken over 6 months before, and she was determined to make Oak Ridge Estates into a picture-perfect community, regardless of who got hurt in the process. The Jeep sat in Grandpa's old carport, which had been specially built for it decades ago. It was clean, well-maintained, and I even took it for drives around the neighborhood on weekends just like Grandpa used to do. "That old military thing needs to go," was the first thing Diane said to me when she came to welcome me to the neighborhood. No introduction, no condolences about my grandfather, just immediate criticism. "It violates Section 4.8 of our covenant regarding approved vehicles visible from the street." "My grandfather's had this Jeep here for decades," I explained. "It's a registered historical vehicle." Diane's perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move an inch as she shook her head. "New resident, new enforcement. You have 14 days to remove it or store it where it's not visible from the street." That was the beginning of a 3-month nightmare that would end with flames, lawyers, and the most satisfying moment of justice I've ever witnessed. The warning notice about the Jeep was just the beginning. Within my first month at Oak Ridge Estates, I received citations for non-standard mailbox design. It was the same one Grandpa had for 40 years. Unapproved exterior paint color. The house hadn't been repainted. Excessive lawn ornaments. Grandpa's small collection of garden gnomes. Unauthorized vehicle cover. The custom cover protecting the Jeep from weather. Each notice came with increasingly aggressive warnings about fines and compliance deadlines. I tried reasoning with the HOA board at their monthly meeting, bringing photos of how the property had looked for decades and explaining the Jeep's historical significance. "Rules are rules, Mr. Peterson," Diane said, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Your grandfather may have been allowed certain exceptions, but the board is committed to consistent enforcement now." The other board members nodded in unison, like puppets on the same string. Only one elderly gentleman, Walter, who'd known my grandfather, looked uncomfortable with the situation. After the meeting, Walter approached me in the parking lot. "Your grandfather and Diane had a history," he said quietly. "He called her out for financial irregularities in the HOA budget last year. She's been waiting for a chance to get back at that property." The next day, I received a certified letter stating that the board had unanimously approved special fines for my continued violations, $100 per day until the Jeep was removed. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. After reviewing my documents, including the Jeep's historical registration, he seemed confident. "They're overreaching," he explained. "The historical vehicle registration provides some protection, and there's no specific prohibition against military vehicles in the original covenant. Plus, grandfather clauses typically apply to pre-existing conditions that predate rule changes." He sent a formal letter to the HOA board outlining these points. Their response was to increase the daily fine to $200. As the fines mounted, neighbors began to take sides. Some slipped notes of support under my door, while others began reporting additional violations, to curry favor with Diane. The pressure was intense, but I refused to hide away my grandfather's prized possession and legacy. He fought for freedom, I told my girlfriend after a particularly stressful HOA encounter. The least I can do is fight for his right to honor that service. But the HOA had more extreme measures planned, ones I never imagined they would dare to implement. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened. I had been at work all day when my phone exploded with texts from neighbors. Fire at your house. Come home now. They're burning the Jeep. I raced home to find fire trucks in my driveway, smoke still rising from the charred remains of my grandfather's beloved Jeep. The carport had also been damaged, and the side of the house was scorched with smoke damage. Through my shock, I noticed Diane standing across the street with 2 other board members watching. Not helping, not expressing concern, just watching with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. The fire chief approached me as I stood staring at the destruction. "I'm sorry about your vehicle, sir. It appears someone doused it with an accelerant and lit it deliberately. We've taken samples for the police investigation." Neighbors gathered around, offering support and sharing what they'd seen. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose house faced mine, was the most forthcoming. "I saw them," she said firmly. "Diane and that maintenance man they hired last month. They were here around noon. I thought they were just doing an inspection, but then they spent too long in the carport. About 20 minutes after they left, the flames started. The police took statements and evidence, but I was in a daze, looking at the twisted, blackened metal that had once been my grandfather's pride and joy, a piece of history that had survived a world war only to be destroyed in a suburban dispute. That evening, as if to add insult to injury, I received another HOA notice slipped under my door. Violation: burned vehicle debris visible from street. Fine: $500 per day until removed. Note: fire damage to property must be repaired with approved materials within 30 days to avoid additional penalties. It was at that moment something inside me broke, and then immediately reformed into steel-hard resolve. This wasn't just about an HOA overstepping its bounds anymore. This was the deliberate destruction of a historical artifact with deep personal significance. I called my lawyer immediately. "They've gone too far," I told him, my voice shaking with a mix of grief and anger. "And I think I know how to make them pay for it." When I explained what had happened and showed him the documentation I still had for the Jeep, including its historical registration, his eyes widened. "The HOA has made a critical mistake," he said. "What they've destroyed isn't just a personal possession. It's a registered historical artifact with federal and state protections. And if we can prove they were involved in the destruction, they've broken laws far beyond their HOA authority." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my grandfather's old desk, looking through his meticulously kept records about the Jeep. Among them I found something I hadn't noticed before: a letter confirming the Jeep was part of the state's protected military artifacts register, which carried specific legal protections and penalties for intentional damage. The next morning I began the process of not just fighting back, but bringing the full force of the law down on those who had destroyed a piece of American military history. The day after the fire, I took emergency leave from work to meet with multiple experts. My first stop was the State Historical Society, where I spoke with Dr. Amelia Jenkins, the Director of Historical Preservation. "What happened to your grandfather's Jeep isn't just property damage," she explained after reviewing my documentation. "It's a violation of the Historical Artifacts Protection Act. That Jeep was officially registered in our database as a preserved military vehicle with documented service history." She pulled up the registration on her computer, showing the detailed history my grandfather had provided: the Jeep's service in the European theater, the unit it had been assigned to, even photographs of my grandfather with it during the war. "This registration means it had state-level protection," she continued. "Willful destruction of registered historical artifacts carries penalties far beyond standard property damage, including criminal charges under state preservation laws." My next stop was the Veterans Affairs Office, where a sympathetic administrator connected me with a military historian who specialized in WW2 equipment. "Your grandfather's Jeep was one of fewer than 300 fully authenticated models remaining with documented wartime service," he told me. "The authorization numbers on his paperwork confirm it was part of a special designation of historically significant military equipment that gives it federal protection as well." By late afternoon, I was sitting in the district attorney's office with my lawyer, explaining the situation to an increasingly interested prosecutor. When I mentioned the historical registrations and protections, she pulled out a specific legal code. "If what you're saying is true and we can prove the HOA was involved in the destruction, They've violated Section 433 of the Federal Code regarding protected historical artifacts of military significance. That's a felony offense. She asked if I had any evidence linking the HOA to the fire. I told her about Mrs. Rodriguez's eyewitness account, the ongoing harassment documented in HOA notices, and the suspicious timing. We'll need more, she said. But I'm authorizing a formal investigation. This isn't a civil HOA dispute anymore. This is potential criminal activity. As I was leaving her office, my phone rang. It was Walter, the elderly board member who had warned me earlier. I can't sleep knowing what happened, he said, his voice tense. I was at the emergency board meeting yesterday morning. Diane said they were going to solve the Jeep problem once and for all. When I objected, they said I didn't need to know the details for liability reasons. I have the meeting minutes and my own notes. I think you should have them. That evening, I received a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Check your email. My security camera caught more than I realized. The attached video clearly showed Diane and the maintenance man at my carport, the man carrying what looked like a gas can. I forwarded everything to both my lawyer and the district attorney. Within hours, the prosecutor called back. We're moving forward with this case, she said firmly. And we've contacted the FBI's art crime team, which also handles protected historical artifacts. They're sending an agent to assess the destruction of the Jeep. For the first time since the fire, I felt a glimmer of hope breaking through my grief. The HOA had thought they were just destroying an old eyesore that violated their precious community standards. They had no idea they'd actually attacked a protected piece of American history, or that their actions would bring consequences far beyond anything they could handle. The legal storm that hit Oak Ridge Estates HOA began with early morning knocks on doors. Police officers, accompanied by county investigators, arrived at the homes of Diane and 4 board members with search warrants in hand. The maintenance man was picked up at his apartment across town. News vans gathered at the neighborhood entrance as Diane, still in her bathrobe, was escorted to a police car. Her face, usually set in a mask of superiority, now showed naked shock and confusion. By afternoon, the charges had been filed. The destruction of a registered historical artifact. Criminal conspiracy. Arson. Filing false HOA violations. A misappropriation of HOA funds, discovered during the investigation. The district attorney held a press conference that made national news. This case represents an extraordinary abuse of power, she stated. What began as HOA harassment escalated to the deliberate destruction of a piece of American military history, a vehicle that served our country during World War II and was protected under both state and federal law. The FBI's art crime team representative added, "The willful destruction of registered historical artifacts is a serious federal offense. This vehicle wasn't just a car, it was a documented piece of our military heritage with specific legal protections." As the investigation deepened, additional discoveries made the case even more damning. Financial records showed Diane had been embezzling from the HOA accounts for years. The maintenance man confessed that he'd been paid $2,000 in cash to help with the Jeep removal, though he claimed he thought they were just going to tow it away, not set it on fire. Most damning was the recovery of text messages between Diane and 2 board members discussing how to solve the Peterson problem permanently, and references to making sure the Jeep disappears in a way that looks accidental. 3 days after the arrests, I received a visit from General Hamilton, the director of the Veterans Military Museum. He had heard about the case and came personally to express his condolences. "Your grandfather's Jeep was a documented part of the 101st Airborne Division's support vehicles," he explained. "We have records of it at our museum. The destruction isn't just criminal, it's a loss to our nation's military history." He handed me a thick folder. "These are the records we have of similar vehicles. While your grandfather's Jeep can never be replaced, we would like to offer a restoration project of a similar model that could be dedicated in his name if you're interested." That same week, my lawyer called with news about civil proceedings. The insurance company has determined this was intentional destruction with criminal intent, which means full replacement value plus damages. Moreover, given the historical nature of the vehicle, they're calculating its value as a historical artifact, not just as an old Jeep. The figure he quoted left me speechless. Over $450,000. Additionally, he continued, we're filing a separate civil suit against the HOA Corporation and the individual board members for harassment, emotional distress, and violation of property rights. With the criminal charges already filed, our case is extraordinarily strong. As word spread through the neighborhood, other residents began coming forward with their own stories of harassment, illegal fines and intimidation. What had started as justice for my grandfather's Jeep was expanding into a complete exposure of years of HOA corruption and abuse. 2 weeks after the arrests, a judge ordered the entire HOA board dissolved and placed under court-appointed management until new elections could be held. All fines issued under Diane's leadership were suspended pending review, and a forensic audit was ordered of the HOA's financial records going back 5 years. The most satisfying moment came when the judge specifically addressed the historical significance of what had been destroyed. "This case represents more than property damage," he stated. "The willful destruction of a registered historical military vehicle strikes at our collective heritage and memory. Such artifacts connect us to our history and to the sacrifices of those who served. The court views this destruction with particular severity." As Diane and her co-conspirators faced both criminal charges and civil lawsuits, I found some peace in knowing that my grandfather's beloved Jeep, though gone, had ultimately served one final mission: exposing corruption and bringing justice to an entire community that had suffered under the tyranny of those who had abused their power. 6 months after the fire, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed. Diane and the former board members had all accepted plea deals rather than face trial, resulting in restitution payments to the HOA totaling over $350,000 for misappropriated funds, felony convictions for the destruction of a protected historical artifact, a ban from serving on any HOA board or community organization. Diane received an 18-month prison sentence, while others received probation and community service. The neighborhood held a special election, resulting in a new board that included Walter and Mrs. Rodriguez. Their first official act was to create a homeowner's Bill of Rights that limited the HOA's power and required transparent decision-making. The insurance settlement and civil damages provided me with the funds to completely restore my grandfather's property and establish a small foundation in his name to help preserve other military vehicles with historical significance. With the Veterans Military Museum's help, I began work on restoring a similar Willis Jeep as part of their collection. A small plaque would tell my grandfather's story and explain how his original Jeep had served not only in World War II but ultimately in bringing justice to a community decades later. The most touching moment came when several of my grandfather's old war buddies, now in their late 90s, contacted me after seeing the news. They arranged to visit during the museum dedication, bringing with them photographs I'd never seen before, pictures of my grandfather with his Jeep in France, Germany, and Belgium. "Frank would be proud," one elderly veteran told me, leaning heavily on his cane. "He always said the Jeep had more fight in it than most men he knew." Turns out he was right even after all these years. The HOA still exists in Oak Ridge Estates, but in a very different form. The new board focuses on community building rather than rule enforcement. The old, aggressive violation notices have been replaced with friendly reminders and offers of assistance for those who might need help maintaining their properties. In my front yard, where the carport once stood, I built a small memorial garden with a stone marker. In memory of Frank Peterson, 1928 to 2022, and his faithful Willis Jeep that served in World War II. Some things are worth fighting for: freedom, memory, and justice. Occasionally, visitors from other HOA communities stop by, seeking advice on how to deal with their own power-hungry boards. I always tell them the same thing my grandfather used to say: know your rights, keep good records, and remember that rules are meant to build communities, not break them apart. The most important lesson from this whole ordeal wasn't about HOAs or even about historical artifacts. It was about standing up for what's right, just as my grandfather had done on the battlefields of Europe and throughout his life afterward. As for Diane and her former board members, I heard they formed a support group for HOA leaders who faced unfair prosecution. Sometimes I drive by their meeting place in my newly restored Willis Jeep, not my grandfather's but similar enough to honor his memory. I don't stop, I don't speak to them. I just drive by, the engine's distinctive rumble a reminder that some things are protected by more than just neighborhood rules. And sometimes, justice comes from places you least expect it, like the historical registration papers for a 75-year-old military Jeep that survived a world war only to face its greatest battle in a suburban driveway.